On our wedding day, my fiancée blamed me for her family's financial woes and publicly announced I will be paying all their debts. I replied, "What a burden." Then I canceled the wedding and her family was left utterly humiliated as their guilt trip publicly backfired. I, 32M, thought I knew the woman I was about to marry. Turns out, I had no idea what was coming. The morning of what should have been the happiest day of my life started with my phone buzzing at 6 a.m. My soon-to-be mother-in-law was calling, which struck me as odd since we'd already finalized everything the night before. Her voice was shaky, and she immediately launched into a sob story about how their family business was facing foreclosure. She explained that they'd been hiding their financial troubles for months, not wanting to burden us during wedding planning. My stomach dropped as she continued. The family restaurant that had been their livelihood for 20 years was drowning in debt. Medical bills from her husband's recent surgery had piled up. Their son's college tuition was overdue. The picture she painted was devastating, and I felt genuine sympathy for them. Then came the request that changed everything. She asked if I could help them out temporarily, just until they got back on their feet. When I asked about the amount, she mentioned it was around $40,000. I nearly choked on my coffee. I told her I'd need to discuss this with my fiancé first, but she quickly mentioned that her daughter already knew about the situation and had assured them I'd be understanding. That comment sent alarm bells ringing in my head. We'd never discussed anything like this. 2 hours later, I was getting ready at the venue when my fiancée finally showed up. Her eyes were red from crying, and she immediately hugged me, thanking me for being so generous with her family. I stepped back, confused, and asked her what she meant. She looked at me like I was being dense and explained that her mother had told her about our conversation. According to her version, I'd already agreed to help with the debt. When I corrected her and said I'd only agreed to discuss it, her expression shifted from grateful to annoyed. She reminded me that I made good money as a software engineer and that her family had welcomed me with open arms from day one. She pointed out how they'd included me in every holiday, every celebration, treating me like their own son. Now that they needed help, she couldn't understand why I was hesitating. I tried to explain that $40,000 wasn't pocket change, even for me. I'd worked hard to build up my savings, and while I wanted to help, this kind of financial commitment needed serious consideration. She brushed off my concerns, saying that families help each other and that once we were married, their problems would become our problems anyway. The conversation left me unsettled, but I pushed those feelings aside. It was our wedding day, and I didn't want to start our marriage with conflict. I decided to table the discussion until after our honeymoon. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Standing at the altar, watching her walk down the aisle in her stunning dress, I almost forgot about the morning's tension. Her smile was radiant, and for a moment, everything felt perfect again. But perfection didn't last long. During the reception, after the first dance and dinner, her father stood up to give a toast. What started as a typical father of the bride speech quickly took an unexpected turn. He began talking about how families support each other through thick and thin, how marriage meant two families becoming one. Then he looked directly at me and began expressing his gratitude for my generosity in helping them through their current financial difficulties. The room fell silent as he announced that I'd graciously agreed to help them save their restaurant and pay off their mounting debts. My blood turned to ice. I hadn't agreed to anything. Every eye in the room was on me now, including those of my own family and friends who looked shocked by this news. My parents exchanged worried glances from their table. But her father wasn't finished. He went on to detail the exact amount I'd supposedly committed to, $40,000, and praised my character for stepping up when family needed help. The guests began clapping, some even cheering, and I felt trapped in a nightmare. My fiancée was beaming beside me, squeezing my hand as if everything was going according to plan. That's when it hit me. This had been orchestrated. They'd planned this public announcement to lock me into the commitment, knowing I'd be too embarrassed to contradict them in front of everyone. Her father concluded his toast by saying how blessed they were to have someone like me joining their family, someone who understood that love meant sacrifice and that their financial burden would soon be lifted thanks to my generous heart. The applause was thunderous, but all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling like jelly, and took the microphone from her father's hands. The room quieted, expecting my gracious response. I looked out at the sea of faces, family, friends, colleagues. all waiting for my words. Then I looked down at my fiancée, whose smile faltered slightly when she saw my expression. I spoke clearly into the microphone, my voice carrying across the silent room. I told everyone that there seemed to be some confusion about the financial arrangement her father had just described. I explained that while I'd been asked to help with their debts that very morning, I had never actually agreed to take on that responsibility. The silence was deafening. Her father's face went pale, and my fiancée grabbed my arm, whispering frantically that I was embarrassing everyone. But I was beyond caring about embarrassment now. I continued, addressing the room about how I'd just learned about their financial troubles hours before our ceremony. I mentioned that while I sympathized with their situation, I found it concerning that such a significant financial commitment had been announced publicly without my consent. Then I said the words that would end everything. I told the room that taking on $40,000 of someone else's debt felt like quite a burden, especially when it was being presented as a fait accompli rather than a genuine request for help. The room erupted. Her mother started crying loudly. Her father's face turned red with anger, and my fiancée looked at me with pure hatred in her eyes. She hissed that I was humiliating her family and destroying our wedding day. But I wasn't finished. I told the room that I couldn't begin a marriage built on financial manipulation and public pressure tactics. I announced that the wedding was canceled, effective immediately. The chaos that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. Her family began shouting at me, calling me selfish and heartless. Some guests started leaving immediately, while others clustered in shocked groups, whispering furiously. My fiancée was sobbing and screaming that I was ruining everything over money. Her father tried to salvage the situation by claiming it had all been a misunderstanding, that he'd gotten carried away in his toast. But the damage was done. Everyone had heard him announce my supposed commitment with absolute certainty, and now everyone was witnessing the fallout. I removed my wedding ring and placed it on the head table, then walked out of the venue. My best man followed me, asking if I was sure about what I'd just done. I told him I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. The aftermath was brutal. Within hours, the story had spread through our social circle like wildfire. Her family's financial troubles, which they'd kept private, were now public knowledge. Their manipulation tactics were exposed, and instead of gaining sympathy, they'd earned judgment from people who'd witnessed the spectacle. My phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages. Some people supported my decision, saying they'd have done the same thing. Others thought I'd handled it poorly, that I should have addressed it privately rather than humiliating everyone publicly. Her family tried damage control, spinning the story to make me look like the villain. They claimed I'd promised to help and then backed out at the last minute. But too many people had witnessed the timeline of events, and their version didn't hold up to scrutiny. 3 days later, her younger brother called me. He apologized for his family's behavior and admitted that the whole thing had been planned. He told me that his sister had convinced everyone that I was wealthy enough to solve their problems and that I'd be too polite to refuse once it was announced publicly. He revealed that they'd been discussing this strategy for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to spring it on me. The wedding day announcement was supposed to be foolproof. Who would dare contradict such a generous gesture in front of everyone? What they hadn't counted on was my willingness to endure public embarrassment rather than be manipulated into a financial commitment I never agreed to. Update 1. A week after the canceled wedding, the real scope of their financial troubles came to light. Her brother reached out again with more information, feeling guilty about the whole situation. The $40,000 wasn't a one-time bailout. It was just the beginning. The family business was in such deep trouble that it needed a complete financial restructuring. Her father owed money to multiple creditors, and the medical bills were even higher than they'd initially claimed. More disturbing was the revelation that this wasn't their first attempt at this kind of manipulation. Her brother told me that when her cousin had gotten engaged 2 years prior, they'd tried a similar tactic with her fiancé. That relationship had also ended badly, though not as publicly as ours. I realized I'd dodged more than just a bad marriage. I'd escaped a family that saw new members as potential ATMs rather than loved ones. The wedding vendors were understanding about the cancellation, especially after word spread about what had happened. Most refunded their deposits without argument, and a few even expressed sympathy for my situation. My ex-fiancée tried reaching out multiple times, alternating between angry accusations and tearful apologies. She claimed she'd never meant for things to go that far, that her family had pressured her into going along with their plan. But her explanations rang hollow. She'd known about the scheme and had actively participated in it. The most telling conversation came when she admitted that she'd seen me as someone who could solve all their family's financial problems. She genuinely believed that once we were married, my money would become their money, and their debts would become my responsibility. Update 2. 2 months post-cancellation, I learned through mutual friends that her family's restaurant had indeed closed down. Without the $40,000 they'd expected from me, they couldn't make their loan payments. The building was foreclosed on, and her parents were forced to declare bankruptcy. Part of me felt bad for them. Losing a family business is devastating, and I wouldn't wish financial ruin on anyone. But I also knew that their problems weren't my responsibility, especially when they tried to manipulate me into shouldering that burden through deception. Her father apparently blamed me entirely for their business failure, telling anyone who would listen that I'd promised to help and then abandon them in their hour of need. But most people who'd witnessed the wedding disaster knew the real story. My ex-fiancée had moved back in with her parents after losing her apartment. Her brother mentioned that she was struggling to find work and had been telling people that I'd destroyed her life over money. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was experiencing firsthand what financial stress felt like. I'd started seeing a therapist to process everything that had happened. She helped me understand that the manipulation tactics her family had used were more common than I'd realized, and that my response, while dramatic, had probably saved me from years of financial exploitation. The therapist also pointed out something I hadn't fully grasped. By making their demands public, they'd actually done me a favor. If they'd approached me privately after the wedding, I might have felt obligated to help and could have found myself gradually drawn deeper into their financial problems. Update 3. 6 months later, I ran into her at a coffee shop. She looked tired and defeated, nothing like the confident woman I'd once planned to marry. She asked if we could talk, and despite my better judgment, I agreed to sit with her. She apologized for everything that had happened, admitting that her family's plan had been wrong. She claimed she'd realized that they'd manipulated both of us, that she'd been as much a victim as I had been. But then she made another request. Could I help her get back on her feet, not as her ex-fiancé, but as someone who'd once cared about her? I looked at her across that small cafe table and felt nothing but sadness. She still didn't understand what had gone wrong. Even after losing everything, her first instinct was to ask me for money. She genuinely couldn't see how that proved that nothing had changed. I told her I hoped she'd find a way forward, but that I couldn't be part of her solution. I wished her well and walked away, feeling lighter than I had in months. The last I heard, she'd moved to another city to stay with relatives. Her brother, who'd been the most honest throughout this whole ordeal, had cut ties with his parents over their treatment of me. He'd gotten a job in another state and was building a life away from their financial chaos. Looking back now, I'm grateful for that disastrous wedding day. It revealed the true nature of the people I'd almost bound myself to legally and financially. The humiliation I'd caused them by refusing to play along with their manipulation was nothing compared to the lifelong burden they'd tried to saddle me with. I'd learned an invaluable lesson about standing up for myself, even when it meant weathering public embarrassment and social judgment. Some people called me heartless for not helping a struggling family, but I knew the difference between genuine need and calculated exploitation. The woman I eventually married 2 years later understood why that experience had made me cautious about mixing love and money. She never once asked me to solve her problems or those of her family, and that independence was one of the things that attracted me to her most. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd gone through with the wedding, if I'd quietly paid their debts and hoped for the best. I imagine it would have been death by 1,000 cuts, a constant stream of family emergencies requiring my financial intervention, my savings slowly drained by people who saw me as an obligation rather than a person. Instead, that one moment of courage at a wedding reception saved me from a lifetime of regret. The burden they tried to place on my shoulders remained exactly where it belonged, with them.